Welcome to the Scifi-ology podcast, where we hope to dig up some of the gems of sci-fi past and present them to you right here for your listening pleasure. I am Scott Johnson, your host through this journey, and my goal is to stop these golden age science fiction stories from being lost in space. Today's story for you all is originally published in the Thrilling Wonder Stories in 1948. The title is Regulations by Murray Leinster. It was only the dew god making a monstrous noise off in the darkness, but Fawns allowed his eyes to open, and he halfway sat up. There was a shaded light over by Bowles's bunk, and Bowles was fussily arranging his kit for a journey to the trading center in the Lamphian Hills. Food, canteens, and the trading stuff. These things would be left at the untended mart in exchange for a new lot of Losa fiber, which, on Earth, was equal in exchange pound for pound with platinum. Fawns made an apologetic noise as Bowles whirled at his movement. Bowles snorted indignantly. "It's just one of them gods," he said scornfully. "They make a racket like that just before dawn every morning." Fawns made himself grin sheepishly, as if half awake. He knew about the dew god. He had more brains than Bowles, and he knew more than Bowles about all the things that really mattered on Oryx, though he'd only been on the small planet 5 months. Because of his knowledge, he'd been awake for hours, feverishly debating with himself whether, as a matter of common sense, he had not better murder Bowles this morning. There were reasons for killing him, but it would be satisfying to let Bowles come back from the Lamphian Hills to find the trading post in ashes, the honky village a mere black scar on the green surface of Oryx, and the supply ship come and gone. It would be amusing, too, to picture Bowles trying to live on Oryx without supplies from Earth until another ship came to reestablish trade. Fawns inclined not to do murder this morning, so Bowles could learn what a fool he'd been. Meanwhile, Bowles regarded him in a superior fashion. "I know," said Fawns. He yawned now. "But the racket does seem louder than usual this morning. I wonder—" "Regulations say native customs and religions ain't to be messed with," Bowles said inflexibly. "You ain't paid to wonder. Quit it." Bowles checked off his equipment on a list. Then he glanced at the instrument bank and laboriously began to copy the regulation before dawn observations into the post's logbook. Temperature, humidity, always 97 to 100% in the daytime, but sometimes dropping to a conservative 90 at night. Ionization constant of the air. Fawns watched the zest. A lot of good these observations were. He said impatiently, "I can fix the log, Bowles. I'm going to do it while you're gone." "While I'm here," said Bowles dogmatically, "regulations say I got to do it. When I'm gone, regulations say you do it. You stick to the regulations, Fawns, and you'll get along." The unholy racket, which was the dew god off beyond the jungle, seemed to grow louder yet. No man, it was said in the instructions for Oryx, had ever yet seen a dew god. But the native deities were of extreme importance to the honkies, and the maintenance of trade relations required that their religion should be undisturbed. "Bless it," said Fawns, in private irony but seeming peevishness. "I wish regulations would let a man do something about that racket. It's tough to be waked up every morning by some kind of honky god with a voice like 16 steam whistles in different keys all going off at once." Bowles struggled into his waterproof garments. On Oryx, where it never rains, one naturally wears waterproof clothing. "Listen here," said Bowles firmly. "You get this. Before this post was set up, the company had a survey party on Oryx for months. You read the report. They studied the place and the natives, and they made up for regulations for this special planet. They're good regulations. You follow them, and you'll do all right. Same way with the honkies. They found out somehow what had to be done to get along. They didn't do it scientific, but like human people did back in the old days. They didn't call what they found out regulations. They called it religion. But it works. It's good regulations for honkies. You get the idea that honky religion is good regulations for them and ain't to be meddled with. Then you won't get into no trouble." "I assure you," said Fawns sarcastically, "I shan't try to make the honkies atheists." "Yeah," said Bowles. "That's it. Don't." Bowles zipped his suit shut. He began to struggle into the various straps which would hold the articles of his equipment about him. Fawns watched with concealed amusement. The honky religion was not to be meddled with? The windows of the trading post rattled from a sudden special uproar from the god. He, Fawns, knew things about the honky religion that Bowles didn't, that the survey party apparently hadn't found out. Gods which roared in the darkness could arouse the curiosity even of a man like Fawns, who despised such stupidities as gods and regulations. Fawns had taken satisfaction in breaking the regulations about honkies under Boyles's very nose. He'd set up a camera and flashbulb and trigger string off where the dew-god roared even now, and he, Fawns, had a photograph of a dew-god. The blinding flash of the flashbulb had startled it. It had crashed into a jungle tree in its flight. And, at the scene of the accident, the crystal was in the pocket of Fawns' sleeping suit. He'd found a memento of honky religion. It had been torn from the headdress of the dew-god. The photograph of the dew-god told how many more such mementos the dew-god wore in his headdress, so Fawns had planned murder for this morning and was still in two minds about its necessity. The prospects before him were enough to make a man giddy. But he wasn't giddy. His plan was carefully worked out. It was so brilliant that he'd honestly regretted that nobody would ever know how magnificent it had been. But there'd been two breaks. One, a space radio message, and the other, this decision of Bowles's to make the trip. Fawns could leave Bowles alive to realize the situation if he chose. When Bowles came back 6 days from now, he'd understand. Not completely, perhaps, but a memento, a small one left on a stick where he'd be sure to see it, would enable him to piece out the story bit by bit as he tried hopelessly to live until another ship came to rebuild human trade on Oryx. Bowles was festooned with all the impedimenta that regulation said should be carried on any journey on Oryx. It was still dead dark outside. The dew-god still roared, though more faintly now. "All right," said Bowles curtly. "I'm off. Mind, you stick to the regulations while I'm gone." "Just which ones do you think I'm planning to break?" asked Fawns ironically. "The ones about leaving native women alone?" Bowles shook his head, unsmiling. Oryx females with a greenish, semi-chitinous skin were definitely not appealing to humans. "Nope," said Bowles heavily, "but you ain't got the right attitude. Regulations got sense behind them, even the honky regulations that they think are religion. Maybe I'd better—" He hesitated, and Fawns knew coldly that Bowles's life hung in the balance without his knowing anything about it at all. "Oh well," Bowles said at last, and thereby removed the need for murder. "I guess you'll make out. So long." He went out of the door and closed it behind him. Fawns heard small splashings in between the dew-god's roarings. There was never any rain on Oryx. Never. So by dawn, the jungle trees were coated with dew in monstrous droplets. Bowles, moving through the supple growths, marched sturdily under a constant waterfall from the trees, his progress disturbed. Then Fawns laughed softly to himself. He took his hand from below the dry blanket a man was to sleep under, on Oryx, if he isn't to wake up in a pool of water. He had a bolt pistol in his fingers. All the time Bowles talked, there'd been that bolt pistol ready to kill him. Perhaps, just possibly, it had been a mistake to let him live. But he'd gone off unarmed anyhow. There was no need of weapons on Oryx. The honkies didn't kill things. Their religion forbade it. And besides, men had red blood like honkies, and there was a religious prohibition against honkies ever looking at anything which was red. Fawns got up and made an adjustment on the space radio. It had been silent for 4 days, since he heard the first notice from the supply ship that it was 10 days ahead of schedule and would arrive before Bowles expected it. He still didn't expect it because Fawns hadn't told him. And he'd gone off now, and the ship would have come and gone, and many things would have happened before his return. Now Fawns readjusted the set for reception and dressed leisurely, smiling to himself. Off through the jungle, the noise of the dew-god died away. Fawns glanced through the trading post window. There was grayness to the east where the local sun rose. No coloring at all, just light. As he watched, the white disk of the sun appeared. There was never any rain on Oryx, and the reason for that anomaly also prevented colorings in the sky at dawn and sunset. Oryx was a magnesium planet. Magnesium was omnipresent on its surface, as sodium is everywhere on Earth. The chloride was the common compound. And just as on Earth there is salt in some concentration everywhere, so on Oryx there was magnesium chloride in the body fluids of the honkies and the insects. There were no animals to speak of, and in the sap of the trees and impregnated in every particle of the soil. The results were outstanding, because magnesium chloride is deliquescent to a high degree. Everything on Oryx therefore attracted moisture to itself, and held it. Everything on the planet was at least moist. If dust were formed by some extraordinary event, it could not remain dust on the ground. It would stick because of dampness. So there was no dust on Oryx, and since there was no dust, there could be no sunset or sunrise coloring, no condensation of moisture on dust particles to form clouds, and therefore, no rain. And since there could be no rain, there could be no brooks, ponds, pools, or lakes. The jungle covered everything, watered by dew which could only condense on solid substances because there was nothing else for it to condense on. It was not a pleasant environment for men, but the honkies lived in it contentedly with their soapstone implements and houses, and their elaborate religion with its ceremonies and taboos. Their culture was low. They had no fire because there had never been lightning to show them that such a thing could be. They had no metals because metals cannot be smelted without a fire. They lived a life of elaborate ritual. Even the location of their villages was determined by a religious abhorrence of the color red. Cultivation of land with a red clay undersoil was therefore impossible, but the local village was safe against accidental impiety. The fields in which the dew god had roared were of a slaty, blue, sticky soil, which Fons knew by experience was incredibly adhesive until the sun dried it. He breakfasted comfortably. So far, he had not done a single overt act, save the muting of the space radio, and that could not ever be proved. He had not murdered Bowles. He could drop everything, make a formal report to the company on what he had discovered, and undoubtedly receive a promotion and a few hundred credits a year more pay. He was enormously amused at the stupidity of which some men would be capable when they could do as he was going to do, and spend the rest of his life in the luxury and lavish enjoyment only unlimited riches could provide. But Fons, of course, was very clever. He approved of himself very much. He finished his breakfast and looked out again. The sun was just 2 diameters high, and the top of the jungle was a scintillating glory. Huge dewdrops covered every leaf. Each reflected all the rays of the sun. The landscape seemed covered with diamonds, save where Bowles had marched. The jungle trees he touched in passing were no longer jewel-studded. Their movements, as he pushed them aside, had made the dew coalesce and run down. His trail was clear. He had gone on to the Lamphian Hills. The restored space radio muttered curtly, "Check for Oryx trading post. Course and speed held. We will land at your post in 32 hours, 15 minutes, Earth measure." It was a repeat notification from the supply ship on the way. This was the last thing Fons needed to be sure of. He buckled the pistol belt around him. He went into the storeroom and opened a soldered case in which a flame rifle had remained in store since the post was opened. He cleaned it carefully. He loaded it from ammunition packed with it. He went to the storeroom door and aimed at the jungle. He pulled the trigger. There was a 10-yard circle of pure devastation. Smoke poured up. Then it stopped. Smoke particles do not remain smoke in air which is supersaturated with moisture. Water condenses upon them. They become droplets of mist. The mist becomes rain. An appreciable shower fell upon the smoldering jungle spot. The smoldering embers went out. Fons grinned. He had not anticipated that, but it was amusing. Everything was amusing today. The sun rose higher and the glittering dew evaporated. It did not form a mist, but made the air actually thick to breathe. Fons remembered an authoritative lecture from Bowles. Each dewdrop, said Bowles, was a tiny burning glass as long as it remained. Until it dried up, it focused morning sunlight on the leaf under it, scorching its own support. So the roaring of the dew god every morning, so loud that leaves vibrated near it, shook the dewdrops into flowing fluid which ran off. The honky crops then weren't scorched, but without the dew god, the honkies would starve. Fawn slung the flame rifle over his shoulder, made sure the bolt pistol was ready for action, and marched off toward the honky village. There were 400 or 500 honkies in the soapstone huts of the settlement. They were greenish in tint, and while their skin was not in actual plates like insects, it was thick and stiff and really flexible only at the joints. They were solemn-faced and quiet and lived their whole lives in impassioned absorption in their religion, as Bowles lived in his devotion to regulations. Bowles said that their religion was regulations and that it made sense. But Fawns had no religion, and he heeded no regulations save those he made for himself. The jungle dried about him as he walked. There was no longer the sensation of walking under a traveling shower bath. It was, save for the wet thickness on the air, not uncomfortable. And in half an hour he had reached the slaty blue soil on which the crops of the honky village were grown. He grinned excitedly and began to cross it toward the village, but he found himself slackening his pace to look at the soil absorbedly. He realized and chuckled to himself. He needn't look for mementos in the ground here. The honkies would have attended to that for him. He continued to grin as he pressed on. He was in open sunshine now, with shoulder-high plants about him and the huddled soapstone huts of the village in clear view ahead. And he saw honkies in the fields. They were working the crops. They used preposterously shaped hoes and dug busily around the plants which formed their food supply. Out of the corner of his eye, Fawns saw them look at him, but he could never catch one actually in the act of staring. He expected protests, and the flame rifle was ready, but whenever he jerked his head about, the honky he essayed to catch was absorbed in his agricultural labor. This, of course, was unexpected. It was forbidden for humans to enter honky villages. The company regulations by which Bowles lived specifically forbade it under any and all conditions. It was a violation of basic principle. Men must not enter honky villages. It was forbidden by honky religion. For a man to enter a honky village was sacrilege. It was blasphemy. It was crime. But the honkies seemingly pretended not to notice. Fawns grew irritated. He was ready to use the flame gun to force his way in after what he knew was there. He was prepared to deal out murder wholesale. His intention to commit what the regulations called crime was obvious, but the honkies feigned obliviousness. They grew thicker as he neared the village. Male honkies, female honkies, smaller ones male and female indiscriminately, scuttled about the taller figures who were adults. All eyed him furtively and knew that he committed sacrilege against their gods in approaching a village. None made any gesture, any actual sign which really acknowledged his existence. Fawn stopped short a bare 10 feet from a male honky, elaborately piling up dirt around the rootstock of a plant. "My friend," said Fawns ironically, knowing the honky would not understand. "I admire your industry, but isn't it a bit futile? Shouldn't you defend your gods and hearth and home? Don't you realize that I'm going into your village? Don't you even suspect I intend to rob your loudest-voiced god? In short, don't you think you ought to do something? Of course, if you do, I will certainly kill you, but this pretense of not noticing me is silly." The honky labored on, his leathery, expressionless face giving no sign that he heard the man's words. Fawns grew jumpy, and his eyes turned ugly for no especial reason. "What's the matter?" he asked, sneering. "You're afraid for that green skin of yours? Where's your piety? Here I am about to commit sacrilege against what I'm assured is a most important religion, and you pretend not to notice?" The honky hoed on. Fawns spat suddenly. "To the devil with you!" he cried violently. He hated the green-skinned native of Oryx simply because he was about to commit a crime against the whole tribe. He needed resistance to assure himself of his courage and cleverness. He craved fear in his victims. He wanted to be able to live over, in his own mind, a scene of splendid derring-do as the source of the lavish luxury in which he would live for the rest of his life. "You're as big as a fool as Bowles. You and your gods, he and his regulations. To the devil with all of you." He glared at the lean, unhuman figure which ploddingly moved on to the next plant and began to hoe there, having given no sign that it knew what Fawns was present. Fawns marched on, chewing upon rage. He passed other honkies, many of them. All pretended not to see him, He was definitely not afraid. The flame gun could destroy all the honkies on Oryx if they tried to attack him. But he raged because he could not understand this embarrassed ignoring of his presence. Then he reached the village. Every house was built on blocks of soapstone, carved to perfection and ornamented with elaborate designs for which fawns at this moment had no taste. The soapstone, Bowles had said, had been brought on honky-back for 50 miles or more, just so the village could be built where there was no red clay under the soil to be turned up by an incautious hoe. It had stood here for generations, perhaps for 1,000 years. It seemed to be deserted, but fawns knew better. The honkies in the villages were not showing themselves so that they might more effectually pretend that he was not there. It was insult. It was stupidity. It denied the courage and the cunning and the cleverness of fawns who had defied honky gods and company regulations to go there and rob the god who roared hideously in the last hour before dawn. He unslung the flame rifle. He'd made his plans carefully, and more honkies would not spoil them. White with tension and with unreasonable rage, he prepared to force the honkies to play their part as he had assigned them. The trick would be the swift and murderous use of destruction to clear the village of those who remained in it hiding, and to force them to fury against him. A brisk looting of the temple of the dew god facing him where he stood would follow, and then a completely ruthless march back to the trading post, using the flame gun mercilessly to make his retreat secure, yet so sparingly that the maddened honkies would yet have had hopes of overwhelming him for his sacrilege and murder. When the supply ship dropped from the sky, the honkies would be besieging the trading post, his tale of a religious frenzy beginning with the murder of Bowles, who was not murdered at all, would be convincing. Under regulations, there would be nothing for the supply ship skipper to do but evacuate the trading post, carrying fawns and the loot he had hidden to the nearest civilized plant, where he could vanish utterly, with wealth incalculable. And he'd demand that the skipper give the village a bath in take-off jet flame as the supply ship rose skyward. With the tale he'd tell, that would be a certainty. It would prove his rage because normally only a man in frenzy demands revenge, and Bowles had an extraordinary popularity among the employees of Consolidated Trading Company. He fired. Coruscating flame enveloped the nearest house. There was the roar of sudden expand air and of burning. A second blast of ravening destruction. A third. A fourth. He saw a few furtive, fugitive moments. The honkies in the village had fled. They were still fleeing. His scheme was working as it would continue to work, and as Bowles would someday figure it out with a single crystalline memento of the honky religion left behind for him, as an overwhelmingly lucid clue. Fawns now had the village utterly to himself. Swearing horribly for no cause, his throat dry and his eyes raging, he went into the temple of the dew god to acquire the riches he knew that were there. They had to be there. A brainy man like Fawns had worked out, from a photograph of a dew god from whose headdress a glittering crystal had dropped, from a blue clay like the blue clay of Kimberley on Earth, and from sheer logic, a brainy man like Fawns had worked out an absolutely airtight case proving that there was wealth incalculable in the temple. The antiquity of the village only increased the estimate. Honkies had cultivated the blue clay fields for probably 1,000 years. Worshipping the dew god and finding bright crystals who looked like solidified dewdrops and reflected the sun as the dew did, surely they would make votive offerings of such crystals. He wore strings of them upon his headdress. Fawns had one in his pocket now, dropped by the god when frightened by a flashbulb. Even the headdress would make Fawns rich, but it was mathematically certain that for 1,000 years every honky had devoutly turned over to the temple every rough diamond found in the growing fields. And 1,000 years of such devoutness would mean untold wealth. He fired the flame gun again from sheer destructiveness, then went snarling into the temple, ready to deal out death to anyone who dared to dispute anything with him. The tall honky squatted on the ground outside the trading post and worriedly mouthed his few words of terrestrial speech. Bowles listened with an air of indignation. "Your runner caught up to me and brought me back," Bowles said dogmatically. "According to regulations, I got to help you out any way I can. But this is bad." The honky struggled again to convey his meaning in Earth language. Then he fell back upon his own tongue. "Lord," he said with dignity, "it was the dew god's doing. We do not understand." The man came through our fields, approaching our village, and this was against the law, so all our people pretended not see, lest he be shamed. Yet he had no shame even in breaking the law. He shouted at us in the fields. He went to the village, where again those who were present pretended not to see. Then he took an instrument we know not, and struck houses with it, destroying everything." "A flame gun," said Bowles, scowling. "This is going to make trouble. He busted regulations." "He went into the temple of the Dew God," the worried honky chieftain went on with dignified emphasis. "And there are bright stones which look like the dew, save that they do not vanish in the sunlight. They are also hard, and we carve our bowls and houses with them. But often, because they are like the dew, we give them to the Dew God. The man seemed to desire them greatly. He tore them from the walls of the temple where they are set, and then he saw the inner part of the temple where the Dew God's holiness stays. We had put the most beautiful of the bright stones there, and the Dew God's holiness covered them. But the man desired the stones so greatly that he threw himself into the Dew God's holiness, and he could not endure it, so he died." "The Dew God's holiness, huh?" said Bowles skeptically. "The Dew God," said the honky chief practically, "shakes the dew from our crops before dawn, so that they do not change color and grow uneatable like the wild things of the jungle. One of us each morning carries his headdress and blows his horn for him among the crops. As the dew falls from the leaves, it hurries to the Dew God's temple. Each morning, dewdrops by millions run into his temple and gather in a great deep gathering, which is the holiness of the Dew God. And we place the brightest stones there to welcome them." Bowles blinked. Then he jumped. "Holy?" he cried. "The dew's like a rainstorm, shook off all at once, and you got a drainage system? Sure, you got a dew pond in the temple, a lake, a swimming pool full of shook-off dew, and bright stones were there?" "Lord, the bright stones are covered by the holiness for a large space," said the honky chieftain apologetically. "And the man seemed to desire them greatly. If we had understood, we would have given them to him. We bring them from a great distance, but it is our religion freely to give one another the things that are most desirable. If it is the custom of men to desire those bright stones, we would surrender them." Bowles looked at the glittering handful of crystals he had taken from the pockets of fawns after the honkies had brought him back. "It ain't worthwhile," he said vexedly. "They what man calls zircons. They pretty, but there ain't any value to 'em for trade. They just hard enough to use as tools to cut soapstones. Fawns thought they were diamonds, I guess. When he saw a swimming pool carpeted with diamonds on the bottom, he went out of his head and dived for 'em. And the pool's probably deeper than it looks. He hopped in to grab zircons he thought was diamonds, and there wasn't any steps like a swimming pool should have, and he couldn't get out again. So he drowned in Oryx, where it never rains. Good grief. The Dew God destroyed him because he broke the law," said the honky respectfully. "He died because he was a fool who didn't keep to regulations," said Bowles caustically. There was a booming noise overhead. It grew and grew in volume. It became a monstrous roar. It was so loud that the leaves of the jungle trees quivered. The supply ship descended smoothly, creating a tumult which seemed to shake the very ground, and Bowles stood up and clenched his fists in the ultimate of exasperation. "He must have known this," Bowles cried furiously. "He knew the ship was coming in ahead of schedule. It was his job to listen on space radio when news comes through. But he didn't tell me. And me with no stuff packed for shipment and due to catch tarnation for holding up the ship? Blast him. It's his fault. He should have kept to regulation." That was Regulations by Murray Leinster, originally published in August 1948 in Thrilling Wonder Stories, Volume 32, Number 3. We all want to march to the beat of our own drum, but oftentimes forget that rules are in place more for our protection than to disturb us. Thanks for listening. Please join us again in our next episode as we continue our exploration into the pulp science fiction universe.